Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar from the UK Customs Academy about classification. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Senior Content Editor at the Institute of Export and International Trade, one of the organisations behind the Academy, and I will be your host for this afternoon. And we're looking forward to hearing lots from you over the next hour or so, and you can contact us at any point using the question panel. At the end of the transition period is now coming truly upon us, and how we trade with the European Union is going to change whether we reach a deal or not. Throughout all of this, proper planning and ensuring compliance with changing regulations and obligations is a must for effective and timely trade from the start of next year. Ensuring you are using the correct tariff codes for the goods you trade is an important part of this. So I am delighted to welcome today's speaker, Steve Cock from KGH Customs Services. Hi Steve, how are you today?
Very well, thank you very much. The odd sleepless night, so yeah, not bad.
Know the feeling too well. So Steve has vast experience working on classification cases, educating judges on the legal basis of classifications at first-tier tribunals. Before I hand over to Steve, though, we'll be running a few polls throughout the webinar today, starting with this one. And this is just to get a sense about who you are, the audience. So we're just asking, what is your role? Are you a customs broker or agent? An employee with responsibility for your company's import or export? And there's other as well. And just while that poll is ongoing, just a couple of housekeeping notes to get through. Firstly, as mentioned, you can contact me with any questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. And afterwards, you will receive access to today's slide pack and the recording of the webinar. So do make sure to really listen in to what Steve has to say today. And I will just give you 5 more seconds to answer that poll. 3, 2, 1. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of you are employees within companies' import-export departments, I think that's supposed to say, 64%. And then 18% of you are customs intermediaries and another 18% other. Steve, any surprises there? Is that about what you expected?
To be fair, actually, I thought there would be slightly more from the intermediary sector, but it does kind of show that the difference in, I mean, obviously the UK Customs Academy is training people from both walks, from the brokerage side and from within companies. And I wanted to use the poll really to gauge what that split might be. And I actually am a bit surprised that it is more from within companies themselves.
A small turnout for the books to begin then. But on that note, over to you, Steve, for the presentation.
Thank you very much. So my name is Steve Cock. I'm the Director of Consultancy at KGH Customs Services. Turning back the clock quite a few years, I started off my working life as a customs officer, and I was quite surprised at the time when working in an inland customs office to find that tariff classification, which realistically is the bedrock of the customs world, wasn't something that was left to officers out in the field, that it was confined to a headquarters role. And that was the case then, which is some 30 odd years ago, and it is still the case largely now. And so even though it drives pretty much everything that customs do, it is something that is guarded, and the main reason for that is because there has to be consistency of approach. And so tariff classifications, whatever we apply in the UK, should equally be applied in Belgium, France, Germany, the other member states. And so it is managed out of a headquarters office, and if there is they each monitor each other's work to make sure that whatever classification decision is given in the UK is mirrored elsewhere. And as a result of that, quite surprisingly, very few customs officers that you will come across actually have a great deal of of knowledge about how classification works. So I'm going to do this from a very, very basic starting position. I've done a previous webinar for the UK Customs Academy that's open to its members. So this is a general broadcast. So the one that I did for the membership is more in detail about what it's like to go to a tribunal, so to go and present a case before a judge. And more often than not, the tribunals, the judges will have never seen a customs case in their life, let alone a classification one. And so you spend the first hour or two educating the judge in what the rules of classification are. But for this one, I'm going to start from the very bottom going up. So as with all things in the customs world and in lots of other walks of life, the complexity of what you talk about is hidden in the many names for what amounts to the same thing. And so particularly with tariff classification, there are all sorts of other ways that it's described: the classification code, the customs classification, the commodity code, the HS code, which is the harmonized system, the CN code, which is the combined nomenclature, and the tariff code, which is the tariff of the European Union. To a large extent, they're all the same thing. They are slightly different. For instance, the HS code is to 6 digits, the CN code to 8, and the tariff code to 10, but they are effectively one and the same. So I indicated that tariff classification is the bedrock of the customs world. It drives the payment of taxes, the amount of duty that you'll pay, anti-dumping duty, excise duty, VAT, and indeed other taxes. But it also determines control measures that are applied by customs authorities. Some authorities do it in a different way, but if you take, for instance, import and export control, dual use licensing for military goods, that is determined by the classification of the goods from the European Union point of view. So it has a much, much wider use than just, this is a code that will determine the amount of tax that I pay. So there are other purposes, for instance, internal taxes. So you get VAT, for instance. In France, there are things called parafiscal taxes, which are based on the nature of a product and the classification that's given to it. There are all sorts of trade policies set in terms of what chemicals can be imported, so drug precursors, things like that. That will be determined by the classification. There'll be monitoring of control goods. So as goods arrive, the classification will tell the authorities what they need to do to ensure that those goods can come in. Then there are things like rules of origin. So if we enter into a free trade agreement with the European Union, one of the things that will come out of that is there will be certain goods that can be traded duty-free. And that will all depend on the classification of those goods and the rule of origin that might apply. Because if we are going to trade duty-free with the European Union, we'll have to demonstrate that we're trading UK goods, not Chinese or American goods. And so there will be a rule that says whether or not something complies with the requirement for UK origin. All sorts of other things. There's transport statistics and price monitoring. So you get Intrastat, which is the current means by which trade statistics are captured within the European Union. Now that we're falling outside of that, that should go, but for a transition period at least, it's going to remain. There are all sorts of quotas. You can only bring in so much of certain goods each year. So for instance, the European Union is very defensive about the amount of sugar that can be imported. And so there will be quota on the amount of sugar that can come from some of the Caribbean countries at a reduced rate of duty. It's also used for completion of national accounts and economic research. But as I say, it is the driving force of customs, and yet, like I say, it's not desperately well understood in a way within customs itself. Maybe that will change. So the classification code itself, it has a structure to it, and this is the structure that is used in the European Union. It's not replicated everywhere around the world. Different places have different numbers of numbers. The one thing that is guaranteed is that the first 6 should be the same. So you have the first 2 digits represent the section of the tariff. The second 2 are the heading within the tariff. Then you have the HS subheading. So the harmonized system is run by the World Customs Organization. It is the standard by which all members of the World Customs Organization should adhere to, and that's pretty much everybody in the world. So it should be that if you're importing a computer into America or a computer into Japan, that you know that it will fall under heading 8471, and that if it's a laptop computer, it's probably 847130. And so that code at that level should be the same around the world. Then you have the national tax measures. And so the CN heading, subheading, the combined nomenclature. The combined nomenclature is a document that is published by the European Commission every year, and it is the bedrock for all of the customs tariffs within the European Union. So at the CN subheading level, you determine the rate of duty that would apply to products. And then there is also a further step beyond that, which is a tariff level, and that's at level 9 and 10, and that's also has tax implication, and that tends to be deviations away from the base rate that you would pay under 7 and 8. And so typically you would have tariff suspensions. So if there is a base rate for a particular product, but that product, a subset of it, isn't available in sufficient quantity within the European Union, or nobody manufactures it, then you can get a tariff suspension for that product and import it free of tax. And then you get an additional tariff code. This is quite rare to use. It's numbers 11 through 14. It's a musing code. I never know how to pronounce it, but anyway, it's something like that. And it's an additional 4 digits that are determined by the amount of sugar or milk protein that is in a product. And you, to find out what that code is, you have to go online to the tariff, which is the European Union's online tariff database. You go into that. If you enter a commodity code that requires that code, it invites you to enter the percentage of sugars, milk fat, milk protein into the calculator, and then it comes up with your code, and then that will determine an additional amount of tax to pay. But standard within the European Union, if you're making an import, you need 10 digits, and you need 10 digits because that drives the tax you're going to pay. But at export, you only need 8, and you need 8 for statistical trade purposes. Intrastat trade statistics are gathered at the 8-digit level, and because there's no tax for export, you don't need to know digits 9, 10, and onwards. So the first 2 digits are the section of the tariff, and so they're grouped together. And as you move through the tariff, in general, things get more and more refined. So you start with live animals and animal products, vegetable products, and then you have the various processed parts of animals. You then have foodstuffs, minerals, and so on and so on. So it's the basic raw ingredients of life at the beginning. So you've got wood and pulp of wood. And then eventually you start to get to the manufactured items. And typically the way that the tariff is structured is that raw materials will have a lower duty rate than manufactured items. And that's all to encourage manufacturing within the European Union. So iron ore, for instance, is duty free, whereas a manufactured car is 10%, and then halfway between the two parts might be 3.7, 4.7% for car parts. Anyway, so we have the textile and textile articles, footwear, headgear, things like that. Then we have articles manufactured from things like plaster and cement and so on and so forth. And eventually you get to section 16, which is machinery and mechanical appliances. So basically things like computers, pumps, you name it, they will go into there. And then we have vehicles and so on. So those are the sections. I'll come on to this in a bit, but the way that these are grouped, they have, there's no legal basis behind it. It's just the way that over time this has developed. And so because things have developed over a very prolonged period, sometimes you get anomalies within it. So as an example, within section 16, you've got machinery, and then you've got electrical goods. Machinery is in chapter 84, but computers are still in chapter 84, even though they're clearly electronic goods. But it's a throwback to a time when computers were punch cards and more a machine than electronics. Anyway, there's no real legal structure to it. It's just the way things are. So now we come to the legal basis of classification. So once you get beyond the 2-digit chapters, you get to the tariff headings. And so the narrative here gives you an indication of what should be included within that code. And so the most obvious one at the beginning is live horses, asses, mules, and hinnies. Well, you'll know if you've got one of those, and that's where it will be classified. The structure, as I say, is very clear cut in terms of progressing through the more and more refined. Some interesting things that I brought up here. So, for instance, I mentioned that the European Union is quite strong at defending duty on things like sugar. The duty rate on cane and beet sugar, for instance, if you look that up, is over 400 euros per tonne. Once you get into things like anchors, grapples, and other metal items, that tends to be about 3.7%, because there's no great industry to protect there. But obviously, the German and French sugar beet industry is heavily defended, and that's one thing that we'll find when we leave the European Union. If there is no deal, if we want to sell agricultural goods, particularly meats, the amount of duty that's going to have to be paid is very high. So within the headings, you have the subheadings, and here I've just taken an example. This is video games, consoles, and other gaming equipment. So you have various subsections within that. And what you're looking to do when you classify is obviously find the narrative that your product belongs to. And then within the subheadings themselves, so if you were to take this one, other games operated by coins, banknotes, so things like fruit machines, you will have subheadings within that, so games with screens, other games, and parts. All the while, you're looking for the clear narrative that describes what you've got. So there are two things that determine how to classify a product. One is the narrative within the tariff, and the other is the tariff notes themselves. And these set out the guidance rules to help you move through the various classifications, because sometimes you're going to find more than one code that might seem to apply. So the section notes and heading notes, they come at the beginning of each tariff section and heading, and they form a pattern. So generally, note 1 deals with exclusions, and it tells you where something might be classified other than where you're looking. So if you're looking at a piece of farm equipment and it's got a drive belt to make it work, if you were to look at section 16, which includes that, it will say that drive belts of rubber are included with items of rubber. It has things like that. So it has exclusions. Then it goes on to deal with the classification of parts. And then finally, the headings will specify other factors that may direct you to the classification of a particular product. So here's a very good example. We've got a mobile phone. And if you were trying to classify a mobile phone, you could say, well, it's a mobile phone, it's a computer, it's a Wi-Fi capable product, it's got a clock in it, it can play music for me. And so you could classify this all over the place. And why don't you? Because there is a tariff note that says that within section 16 that deals with electronic goods, classification should be based on principal function if there are a number of functions. And at the end of the day, a mobile phone is a mobile phone. It defaults to that function first and foremost. And so these devices are still classified as phones, even though they have extensive computing power. So those are the tariff notes. I'm now going to turn to Will and ask for another poll. Are you there, Will?
Yeah, I'm here, Steve. So I'm just going to launch our second poll for today. This one is asking, have the UK authorities shared sufficient information for you to be able to prepare for Brexit? The options range there from strongly agree to strongly disagree. It'd be very interesting to see the results there. Just while people are answering that poll, Steve, a couple of questions from our audience so far. Zanita has asked, in essence, how often do tariff codes change?
Well, it will depend where you are, I guess. Certainly the European Union has two main times when they revamp codes. The beginning of each year, the combined nomenclature is republished, and so there's a lot of change there. But also there's a lot of change in July. But that said, it does change on an ongoing basis. The key codes themselves don't particularly change, but if you're dealing in agricultural goods, sometimes they change. There are periods in the fruit growing season, for instance, where duty rates change. And you also get things, I mentioned tariff suspensions earlier. If something is not produced in the community in sufficient quantity, they get introduced at the beginning of January and the beginning of July. And so if one is introduced, you've obviously got a new code, but they also get withdrawn. So those are the two main times.
Thank you. And I think this is a follow-up question from Paul, who asks, do the number of digits in the code change in different countries?
They do. I mean, typically, I think 10 or 11 is fairly common, particularly where it's dealing with imports. 6 is always standard, but the only ones off the top of my head that I know of to recall are the EU's 8 and 10 for imports and exports. But I think it's Israel does 11. Anyway, you can look them up.
Thank you, Steve. And just going to close that poll and share the results. Thank you, everyone, for answering. Interestingly enough, there's quite a divide there, actually. So 22% agree, 1% strongly agree, 39% of you remaining neutral, and then the rest, 30 to 39% disagree or strongly disagree. So quite a spread there. Any thoughts on that, Steve?
I don't know. I mean, I kind of assumed that there would be a lot who thought that it was that they agreed that there had been enough information, because they tend to be the more prepared, whereas others who are less prepared would be the more to the strongly disagree. I guess I didn't quite anticipate quite the spread that there is, but it's interesting. I guess at the end of the day, what I particularly find in terms of the companies that we deal with, there is a real reticence still to address Brexit. And when I talk to companies in different member states, there are different attitudes. So the Belgians and the French, for instance, and the Dutch, maybe it's because they're close to us and we share the channel with them. They seem to be very much more pragmatic and prepared for Brexit than, for instance, the Germans and Austrians. And there seems to be very much a view that either Brexit was never going to happen, or that if it does, well, everything will be okay, and that we can prepare when we get to it. Yeah. So I don't know. There's just a broad range of views, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, which probably reflects the broad range of views on Brexit from day one, really. But
yep.
Yeah, that's that poll over, and back to you for the presentation.
Okay. So the classification is a funny thing. Some people like it because it's in some ways, I wouldn't say difficult, but it is one of the more thoughtful processes that you ever go with for customs. For instance, if you're determining whether something has UK origin or not, there'll be a strict rule that you apply, and it might say that 40% of the value of that product must have originated in the UK. So there you go, that's easy. You can just say yes or no to that. Classification is far more a mixing pot. It's almost like making a stew, because there are so many different elements to bring in. So the first thing that we've mentioned is that there are the headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings, and they have a narrative, and that you must go by those. Then we've said, but then there are some tariff notes, and so if you haven't failed to read all the tariff notes that might affect the classification that you're looking at, then you might have got the classification wrong. Now, on top of that, there are also the general interpretive rules of classification. So in your head, you've got to hold three things at any one time in able to classify a product. I mean, simple things will always go to obvious headings, but when there's more than one possibility, you have to try and balance these three things together. And so the general rules, they come in 6 parts. Most classifications are achieved through rule 1 and 6. So the 4 in the middle, there's nothing to them effectively for most times. Within those, you've got rule 3A, which is hard to apply. I'll come on to these in a bit more detail in a sec. Rule 4, I've never ever come across a case that invokes rule 4 because it's basically, there is no classification, so you'll have to go for something very similar. But the one thing to remember whenever you're going through the GIRs, and I'll stress this again and again, is if you're comparing classifications, you can only compare at the same level. So if you're looking at the 4-digit, you can only look at narratives at the 4-digit level together, or at the 6, or at the 8 or the 10. You can never compare a 6 with an 8 or a 6 with a 4. I'll come on to that in a bit more strongly later. But I'll take you through the rules one after the other. So GIR1, this drives the classification for most products. And what it says is what I've already indicated really, is that the titles of the section, chapters and subchapters are provided for ease of reference only. So the way that the tariff is structured, the form that it's in, that's just because it is. For legal purposes, classification shall be determined according to the terms of the headings, so that's the 4-digit level, and any relative section or chapter notes. So you've got to look at the headings first and look at the chapter notes and see if that helps you out. And then it goes on to say, and provided such headings or notes do not otherwise require according to the following provisions. And then it goes on into GRs 2, 3, 4, and 5. But at a very basic level, if you're classifying something, just look at the headings. If you find only one heading that fits your product, then you're home and dry. At the same time, you should refer to the section or chapter notes just to make sure that, for instance, the thing that you think you've classified correctly, which is a drive belt for agricultural machinery, as a part it shouldn't be classified in with the agricultural machinery itself, but it goes as a drive belt of rubber. So lots of classification cases go to the European Court of Justice and they give decisions on the correct classification of a product. And these are 2 phrases that you always see in every ruling. And what it says is the decisive criteria for the classification of goods is in general to be sought in their objective characteristics and properties. So in other words, quite simply, what is it? What does it do? And in that regard, they quite often point out that the officer classifying goods at the port should be able to classify it on the basis of what lies before them, and also that it should be done on the level of a competent business person. What might they view the classification to be? Sometimes cases do go into immense detail and you look at the physics of how a product works, but for the most part, it is objectively, what is it? What does it do? And then it goes on to say as defining the wordings of the relevant heading. So we're back to that. It's classification according to the heading. They also go on to say that the intended use of a product may constitute an objective criterion for classification, but only if it's inherent to the product. So just because you say that you're going to use a product for a particular purpose and advertise it accordingly, that wouldn't necessarily be good enough to change the classification of it. It has to be inherent in that product, and you must be able to assess it on the basis of the product's objective characteristics. In other words, it is what it is. So that's GIR1, and that always goes in tandem with 6. And so you've got to look at it as a circle. So you start with GIR 1, and let's assume that there is only one heading that you find. You don't need to go through 2, 3, 4, and 5 now. You can jump straight to 6. And all that 6 says is, for legal purposes, the classification of goods in the subheading of the heading shall be determined according to the terms of that subheading. In other words, find a heading at the 4-digit. Now we can look at the 6-digit level and look at the narrative that you have there. And then you're going to pick the narrative that suits your product. And again, assuming that you only find one subheading that suits your product at the 6-digit level, you come back again through the cycle of 1 through 6 again, and then you're back to determine the classification at the 8-digit level. So in a very roundabout way, all that 1 and 6 are saying is, look at the narrative, find one you like, as long as there's no other at that level, proceed down to the 6, and then the 8, and then the 10. And it's simple as that. And that is most classification done and dusted. As I mentioned before, you must only look at classification at the same level. You must never compare between the two. And so there will be occasions when you might find a heading that you like the look of, and then while you're checking around to make sure that everything else looks good, you spot something at the 6-digit level that you quite like the look of as well. If you do, you can only start to invoke that subheading as a possible classification if you can look back up and see that the 4-digit level could also apply to your product. If it can't, you can't get there. So the other general rules of classification then, the second one deals with incomplete or unfinished goods. And so what GIR 2 says is that any reference in a heading to an article shall be taken to include a reference to that article incomplete or unfinished. And so, for instance, if you're importing a tractor, and for ease of shipping it, because you're going to want to stick it in a great big container, you might want to take the wheels and the cab off. Otherwise, it just won't fit in the 40-foot container you want to ship it in. And it could be that those wheels and that cab are shipped in a separate container at a different time, or indeed those wheels might be purchased in the UK, whereas the tractor's made in Japan, and so they're never imported. But at the end of the day, what you're importing is still a tractor, because it has the engine, it has the axles, it has all the drive mechanism to make it work. It's just missing the tires or the wheels. So incomplete or unfinished products can also be imported as the complete item. And the other thing to say is, this is a rather extreme example of a bicycle that's split into two, but if you were to import the front fork of a bicycle separate to the back end of a bicycle, you've got an incomplete bicycle. But if you're importing it in the same container or on the same ship, for instance, even, but in different containers, you still classify it as a finished bike. And that can be important because things like anti-dumping duty apply to certain products. So if at one time the Chinese were mass producing bikes and trying to corner the market in cheap bikes, anti-dumping duty was applied to those products to raise the price within the European Union. And so one way of avoiding that would be to break it down into its parts and then import the parts. It's a different classification, and the anti-dumping duty didn't apply. But if you made the mistake of shipping all those parts together on the same ship, then you have to classify it as the finished product. And it doesn't matter how detailed that manufacturing process is. If it's there and it's ready for assembly, then that's the finished product. The other thing to say is you get products which are basically blanks. So here you've got a picture of some wheelie bins as they're imported. It's effectively the finished item that's coming in. The casters and the lid are added later, and it's painted or whatever. But that effectively is the finished product because it's recognizable as such. And then GIR 3B deals with any reference in the heading to materials or substances shall be taken to include a reference to mixtures or combinations of that material or substance with other materials or substances. It's just a very longhand way of saying, if, for instance, you have a glass paperweight, it's an item of glass, even if you put a bit of felt on the bottom or a bit of cork on the bottom to protect it. At the end of the day, it was still a piece of glass. So that's GIR 2. Moving on to GIR3, this is where you get to when you have a classification conflict, where you have found, for instance, at the 4-digit level, 2 codes that might apply to your product. And at this point, you have to clearly determine which one might be the right one. And so here it's a 3-tiered process to get to the right result. And you go through GIR 3A, then B, then C. You have to do it in order. And the first one it says is the heading which provides the most specific description shall be preferred to a heading providing a more general description. And the problem with that is that if 2 of the headings are still of equal merit, then you have to continue onwards. So it's quite an odd thing to hold in your head, that they'll say that if you've got a more specific description, you can go with that. But at the same time, if there are 2 that merit equal consideration, you must progress onwards. So there are a couple of examples here, what could fall into that. So for instance, if you've got shavers and hair clippers with an electrical motor in them, they're classified in heading 8510 and not as 8467. So in 8467, that would be as hand tools. And obviously it's an electric hand tool because the person uses it in the hand. But the truth is 8510 provides a better answer because it specifically covers shavers and hair clippers. Equally, you might have a carpet that's being imported, and that carpet might be for use in a motor vehicle. And therefore you might consider that to be a part of a motor vehicle, but in fact within heading 5703 there is a more specific heading for carpets for that purpose. So it's not a commonly used GIR 3A. More commonly used is 3B, and this is where you get to products that are classified on the basis of their essential character. So this applies to mixtures of goods, composite goods. So look at the mobile phone potentially, that's a composite good. It's got all sorts of bits and pieces making it work. And then goods in retail sets. So for instance, a bath set, something that is put together, different items that are sold on. Now under 3B, in all cases, classification is determined by the essential character of the product. And what might that be? And there are numerous European court cases and national court decisions about what essential character might be. But largely it devolves down to factors such as the bulk, what's there the most of, the quantity, again, how many of that thing are there compared to another thing, the weight, the value, typically value plays quite an important role, and the role of the product itself. And in determining between those, commonly what the European Court has said to do is consider whether the product can function following the removal of one or more of the elements. So in other words, if the product, if you take something away, has no function at all anymore, then that's clearly essential to its function. But if you can take away that function, it effectively is non-essential. The problem is, as often as not, you take away one function and the other one, though still present, no longer functions. And so as it turns out, both were essential to the function of the product. And if you get that, we'll come on to 3C in a second. But before that, there's this expression, goods put up for sets for retail sale. So what might that be? So that's basically 2 or more different articles which would be classified in different headings. So for an example, 6 dinner forks, well, they're just dinner forks, so they'd be classified as dinner forks. But when you're classifying a set for a retail sale, it has to be something that when it's combined together has a specific purpose in mind. And so if it doesn't, then you have to classify the items separately, even though they might be put in the same thing to sell on. And they have to be something that is packaged ready to be sold to the customer. So some examples of things that might be classified all together would be, and this I find quite surprising, a packed lunch. So if you had a set consisting of a sandwich made with beef or with or without cheese in a bun, that's classified as a food item in 1602. And if you've got French fries, that's in 2004. But in those circumstances, the main part of the supply would be the sandwich, so it's classified in 1602. And then you get other things. So if you've got a fresh food recipe that's got the items in it, if you've got a hairdressing set, which has the clippers, a towel, a brush, that can all be classified together. And typically that would come under the 8510 for the electrical clippers, and then drawing sets, that kind of thing, they would be classified together. What you wouldn't get classified together, and I worked for some time for doing classification for Marks and Spencer, were their Christmas gift lines. More often than not, can't be classified together, which is a bit of a pain. So if you've got a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of wine together, that can't be. Or if you've got port and cheese together, they can't be classified together. So you have to split them, and you have to attribute the relevant value to the goods that are being imported. So 3C, the final one, is if you can't classify them according to anything else, you classify them last in order in the tariff. So if you've got something classified in Chapter 84 and something in 85, then the function in Chapter 85 wins out. So I mentioned before that you've got kind of a mixing pot of various factors that you've got to bring together: the narrative to the headings, the tariff notes, and then the GIRs. So here we've got a smoke detector, the type of thing that you would find on, in a room. It's got the cover taken off the front, and inside it, it's got three things. It's got an alarm, it's got a smoke detector, and it's got a heat detector. And the question would be, how do you classify that? It falls into the part of the tariff where principal function under GIR1 is important. So maybe the principal function determines the classification of this. Or because there are more than one element that combines to make up the product, maybe it's GIR3B because you've got a combination of machines fitted together. Or maybe it's GIR3, last in order of the tariff, because you can't choose between the two. In this circumstances, it probably is GIR3 because you've obviously got the fire alarm. Well, if you don't detect the smoke or don't detect the heat, then there's no alarm to sound. And if you have no detectors, then nothing's going to trigger the alarm. And so in this instance, there is probably no principal function. There is probably no essential character. And so you go for last in order of tariff, which would be 9027. So those are the things that you have to consider when you're looking at multifunction products. Don't forget to look at the tariff notes. They may be important. So quickly skipping through GIR4, as I said, I've never seen it used because there's always a classification for anything. So for instance, within chapters 84 and 85, there is a catch-all: mechanical goods not elsewhere classified, or in 85, electrical goods not elsewhere classified. And so the chances of you finding something that nobody's classified before are almost zero. And I'm going to skip over GIR5 again. This deals with cases and packing. So under GIR5, if you've got a camera case, a musical instrument case, and it's got the product in it, then the case is classified along with the product itself. If you're importing a camera case on its own, or a musical instrument case, then you classify it as a case. And the packaging that travels with goods, the cardboard boxes and everything that it's packed in, well, then that's classified along with the product as well. So I'm coming towards the end of the presentation. Parts and accessories. So when you're classifying a part, you'll often find within a part of the tariff, it will say, for instance, telecommunications equipment, and within that chapter, that's chapter 85.17, it will have, heading 85.17, it will have a series of subheadings, and one of them, the last one, will be parts, and that is very common within the structure of the tariff. For something to fall within the definition of a part of a mobile phone, you have to hit this goal. This is again something that's determined by the European Court. So parts implies a whole into which the part is incorporated. Well, that's obvious. But that part has to be essential to the mechanical or electrical functioning of that product. So that would seem fair enough. So if we look at a car, for instance, the parts of a car or a moped, you might automatically think, well, that belongs in that particular heading along with the parts of a vehicle. But if you go into the tariff notes, you will find, as I indicated, there's the exclusions. Generally, note 1 is the exclusions, and then note 2 generally deals with the classification of parts. And one of the common themes of that is, if the part is described somewhere else within the tariff as an item of its own, then that's where it gets classified. So even though a petrol engine might be a part of a car, there is a classification for petrol engines, and therefore a petrol engine gets classified in its own right. Then there are accessories. So for something to be classified as an accessory, it has to provide a service to the main product. And again, you will often find that there will be a part of the tariff that talks about parts and accessories. So I mentioned mobile telecommunications apparatus, mobile phones. If you go into that section, then it only mentions parts. There is no classification code for accessories of a mobile phone. And so if you look into the classification of mobile phone cases, for instance, they tend to be parts of plastic, or there is a heading for cases and it may be classified there. But if you've got parts and accessories for computers, for instance, there is a specific heading for that. So computers are in 8471, parts and accessories for computers are in 8473. So something that provides a service to the main product, in this case a computer, would be classified there. Having said that, it would have to provide a service that extended the functionality of that computer. And so, for instance, a computer carrying case doesn't extend the functionality of a computer, it's just a convenient way to lug it about. And so a computer case would still be kept along with cases. So parts have to be part of the whole. They have to be essential to the function of the product, either electronically or mechanically, but they could have their own heading. An accessory has to extend the function of a product. But you will find those two commonly used terms within the tariff. So my final observations on classification are that more often than not, the classification that you're looking for is blindingly obvious. A nut, bolt, and screw made of iron or of copper will be classified along with other nut, bolts, and screws. Generally, you will find that there are very few complex cases. The unfortunate kink in all of that is sometimes the obvious is wrong. And so if I refer back to the smoke detector, the fire alarm, it could well be in that case, if the classification, and this is a case that's in dispute at the moment in the UK courts, it could be that fire alarm is in fact not a fire alarm, but it is a smoke detector, because the only way it becomes a fire alarm is if it detects smoke in the first place. And so that's basically it. So, Will, have you got any more points?
Yeah. Just before we go into the Q&A, we'll just put on another poll. And so if you can move to the next slide during the poll, there'll be instructions on how people can ask questions. But the last poll for the day is, where do you envisage the biggest problem associated with Brexit? The options here are lack of capacity in the brokerage industry, importing goods, exporting goods to neighbouring EU member states, or exporting goods to non-neighbouring EU member states. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Just while you answer that poll, I'll put a first question to you, Steve, from the Q&A. So Carol asked, how do you classify composite food products? For example, a shepherd's pie.
Okay, so that could be quite difficult, really. Food classification is not my speciality, I have to say. I tend to be more in the electronics sector. But if you look for the classification of a shepherd's pie, you won't find one. But what you'll have to do is go to GIR 3 and start to consider, because you've got a mixture of goods, you will have to consider, is there a more specific heading over and above the others? Well, there won't be, because there isn't one for shepherd's pie. And so you have to look at what the shepherd's pie is made from. And of course, it's going to be largely potato and beef. And I did a review for somebody not so long ago who were involved in products like this. And quite surprisingly to me, shepherd pie turned out to be classified as potato, because in the particular case I was looking at, potato was the predominant material that was used in its manufacture. And so you find that quite common in things like sausage rolls and pasties and meat-based products. As often as not, they're classified along with baker's ware, because pastry will make up the bulk of the product that you're actually buying. Hopefully that's enough.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of the shepherd's pie as a potato, but there we go. That's the world of tariffs. Just going to close and share the results to that poll. 37% have listed exporting goods to neighbouring EU member states as the main concern. A lack of brokerage industry capacity is up there with 30%, and then importing goods follows 24%, exporting to further away EU member states trails at 9%. I guess no surprises on the neighbouring EU member states. Any surprises on the capacity in brokerage industry there, Steve?
Well, I mean, I suppose there would be two things I would say. The first is on capacity. There is a lack of capacity. There is no doubt about that. For companies that have secured customs agents already, then obviously they should be fine. But as I mentioned earlier, in particular Germany, we as a company represent companies across Europe. And we've had very few German companies inquire about our services. Now that's only just started in the last few weeks. And to a large extent, we have to turn people away. And there are other people within the brokerage industry who are doing exactly that. So I think that's going to become big news over the next month or two. The other thing that I would say is I put the point in there about delivering goods to other EU member states. I personally feel that is where the biggest problem lies ahead of us, because UK customs allowing imports to be made without condition almost. You can just bring them in for the first 6 months of the year, and as long as you maintain a record of what you've imported, you can play catch up and you can declare them later on. So that's easy. Goods can still come in. If you're exporting to France, that's relatively straightforward, or to Ireland. You just raise an export from the UK and then you raise an import into France back to back. It's quite simple. The problem comes is if you want to ship to Germany through France or to Belgium or somewhere else, because unless you're prepared to import into France and register in France for VAT, then you've got to engage in something called community transit. And that is the one piece of the Brexit jigsaw puzzle that nobody seems to have really taken hold of and stressed. Because transit comes with all sorts of difficulties. You have to have a guarantee in place in case the goods go missing in France on their way to Germany. And you have to allow for customs inspection as the goods are leaving the UK and as they arrive in Germany. It's not like UK customs can just write their own rules on this. There's an international convention. And so I suppose the two things I would say to look out for in the next month or so is, one, the bemoaning that there is insufficient brokerage capacity and the infighting maybe between the government and the sector about whether or not there was sufficient capacity and whether or not the government were aiding through a grant system for it to be put in place. But the other thing is exporters, when we get to the 1st of January next year, bemoaning the fact that they cannot actually get their goods out of the country because they find that they have to engage in community transit, something they just simply weren't aware of. Anyway, that's me off my high horse, but yeah, it will be troublesome, clearly, what's going to come.
And for any of you who are unfamiliar with transit, we did actually do a Customs Academy webinar on it in September, so we can circulate the link to that recording. So moving on to some more user questions, I think one question in from Hazel, who's asked, would a binding tariff information avoid any issues?
On a simplistic level, if you write to the authorities, you can ask them for a binding ruling that says to you, you've told us what the goods are, you've told us what you think the code is, now we'll tell you what we think the code is. It could be the same. And if you get that, then of course, you can rely on that. unless customs turn around later and say, actually, we got that wrong and we're going to change it. But historically, up until the point they've changed it, you can rely on it. So it does take away your worries if you get what you want. The only downside to that is, what if you don't get what you want? Because you may well have been right and the ruling you get from the authority is wrong. But now if you want to prove that you're right, you have to go down the legal route of demonstrating it. And so you have to raise an appeal, go to tribunal, and that's the type of thing I do quite a bit. And then it becomes quite costly. So historically, I would have said to clients, well, maybe you want to get a binding tariff ruling. Evidence to the contrary of all the legal work I've done over the years suggests that that's probably not the best thing you can do. You can write to the authorities and ask for a classification opinion, and it's not legally binding. So as long as you've got a good reason for doing what you continue to do, if you don't go along with the opinion, then you're not legally bound to do it. Then again, customs will come along and audit you and say, why didn't you follow the opinion? But yeah, BTIs, I'm not the greatest fan of anymore, I'm afraid.
Interesting, that's very interesting. A few people have asked about the UK Global Tariff. So James asked, do you know if the UK tariff will have 8 or 10 digit codes? Will there be any likely divergence from current commodity codes that we use?
There will definitely be divergence from the EU codes. There's going to be a lot of simplification. At the moment, it's showing at the 8-digit level in what's being published online. Certainly at export, there's no reason for it to increase based on that. But given I'm sure that the UK will allow tariff suspension still, then it's almost certain that they'll go to the 10-digit level. But it's a question I've been asking myself, and the answer's not that forthcoming.
Interesting. A couple of questions in about where you can find information on codes. Chad asks, can you just use a search engine? So yeah, where can people find the relevant codes for their products?
Okay, I mean, I do use Google sometimes when I look for the tariff classification of products. So I'll put tariff classification windbreak, for instance. I did that not so long ago when I've got no idea myself and it brought back no result. But commonly you will find that it can bring back something. If you're going to do a search, I would recommend putting cross, as in the word cross, ruling. Now it's the American Tariff Classification Database. And the American rulings are very good because it gives you a legal description of how they achieve the classification they've got. So if you put cross ruling, in my case, windbreak, it came up with nothing. But if you put cross ruling tractor, then it will bring up a host of cases where the officer has written to the person. You even get the officer's name, where the officer's written to the person and explains how they classified that product. And they're very good.
Thanks, Steve. One last question because we're short on time now. So this one, a couple of people have asked similar questions. I'm going to ask this one from Lee, who asks, what happens when the seller classifies a product as one commodity code, whilst the buyer uses another commodity code for the same goods? And what should be shown on the bill of lading? Okay,
so it is the importer or the exporter's responsibility to classify their goods. And so from an importer's point of view, if you believe that the exporter's got it wrong, you go with your code. And there are differences in policy within different blocks of the world. And so you do find deviation, particularly the Americans and Japanese have a more steady approach to classification, more so than the European Commission, which tends to be a bit warped by duty rates. And so you do find not exactly trade wars, but difference of opinion can lead to cases going to the World Customs Organization. So go with your code.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for the questions. Plenty more where those came from, but hopefully we've helped answer most of them there. So on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you once again to Steve for the presentation and answers. I hope everyone has found that useful. If you do have any questions or queries, please do go to the site ukcustomsacademy.co.uk or contact us at info@ukcustomsacademy.co.uk with those queries. And also please do let us know of any further suggestions for future topics or future webinars. But for now, that's all from us today. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for tuning in.